Alright guys, so let's move on to training for label acquisition now. For training for label acquisition, Alex, like we had learned in the start of the study that Alex already had over 80 plus labels for various objects, various colors, various shapes already learned prior to this study, prior to same and different study. So in order for him to train on same and different, we had to understand how was he trained with label acquisition. Thus, continuous reinforcement could be used, right? Because we already needed to learn, we needed to know his learning strategy and how he had learned successfully through model rival technique, right? So let's move on to what's model rival technique. Model rival technique involves two humans. The first human acts as the trainer. The he presents one, two, or like depending on the question, as many objects as he would to the second trainer. Keep in mind that this is training for label acquisition, not training for same and different. So it's not necessary for the first trainer to introduce only two objects to the second human. He can also introduce multiple objects and ask how many. And he could introduce only one object and he could ask what's this, right? So he would ask multiple questions depending on the objects. What's this? What color? What shape? How many? All right, to completely test Alex and successfully carry out model rival technique. All right, so firstly, he would, if the second human gave a correct response for the question that was asked, he would be rewarded with one, two, or all of the objects depending on what objects he was asked the question for, right? So he would be awarded with all of the objects, rewarded with all of the objects. Um, and when the second human would give a wrong response or an incorrect response, the first human would show disapproval of that, or like he would err, right? So they also tried to make the second human act as a parrot, like he the second human was told to give wrong responses that would represent Alex's wrong responses, such as he could have just said green, but the real answer would be greenwood, right? So they tried to make it as easier for Alex to understand his own wrong responses as well. So keep in mind that this was all happening in front of Alex. Alex was also more than welcome to participate in these vocal changes. Alright, so secondly, awarded with both the objects continuous reinforcement to make sure that there was a very strong association built between the object category and the label that had to be learned. The researchers made sure that every time Alex gave a correct response, he would be awarded with both the objects, one of the objects, like, or just like one object if he would be asked a question for just that specific object, or all of the objects, right? So to make sure that a perfect reinforcement schedule was made for that, he was awarded with all of the objects he was asked a question for, right? So, and to make sure, and obviously he's a parrot, it's not necessary that every time he's asked a question for a specific object, he would be interested in that object, right? He could not be interested in specific objects that he could have been asked questions for. So for that, the researchers also tried to accommodate him for that. He was allowed to request alternative objects in the place of the objects that he would have been asked questions for. But keep in mind that he had to use a perfect full sentence to request that object. He had already been used to preface requests like I want. So like an interruption like cork would have been considered an error, but an interruption like I want cork would have been considered as a valid request, right? So he had to use full phrases to request his thing, otherwise he would have not been awarded with objects. with those objects. And also another condition for that was that Alex was required to give the response for the object that he had been asked question for first, but after giving the correct response he could have been awarded with alternative objects. And most of the times researchers were quite sure that he wanted the objects that he would request for, such as he would eat the walnut, or he would use a cord to scratch his beak, uh, to clean his beak, sorry, or he would use the key to scratch himself, right? So he was so for like I said before, animal ethics have been really high in this study. um, his choices, his preferences were all accounted for. All right, so let's move on to same and different training. Same and different training was also very similar to label accusation. Why? Because same, the model rival technique was used here as well. So how was it different here? Um, the first human would present two objects to the second human and would ask what's same or what's different. So, for example, he could have presented a red wooden triangle, and he could have also presented a blue wooden triangle, right? And he could have asked what's different. So the color is different, and the correct response was only the label of the category in itself, not the specific color, or not the specific shape, or not the specific material, right? So, and like in the training for label acquisition, the second human was awarded with both the objects he gave a correct response for, and he would be shown disapproval of wrong responses. How did that exactly happen? So there was when the second human gave a wrong response, the first human would say emphatically no. Then there was a timeout where the second human would turn, when the first human would turn around, and then he would turn back and repeat the question itself, right? So that's how that took place. So Alex would know that I gave a wrong response and I need to give a correct one again, right? So, and also researchers also made sure that same and different training was only limited to a specific set of familiar objects. Familiar objects were those objects that Alex already had labels for, right? Such as he already had labels for blue, green, yellow, rawhide, right? So all those specific objects, specific familiar objects, were limited to same and different training, because later on Irene wanted to test Alex on objects that he does not even have labels for, to just like test him, and like see what happens when he is presented with novel objects also, right? So um, the both the categories of color and shape were contrasted. The researchers also made sure that this training was limited to, if the label of the categories were asked, this was only limited to color and shape, because for Alex to learn material, it took a lot of time, right? Because the label material was not in his label repertoire, and to acquire that in same and different training, it took a lot of time for that. So the initial training was only limited to color and shape, where he could only reply with the category of the color or the shape itself. And yeah, so he was trained on the third label, which was material. So that's how same and different training took place.